In the late 1950s, at the height of the Cold War, a quiet yet extraordinary land transaction took place between the Soviet Union and the young state of Israel. It involved not just diplomacy, but land and oranges. The story centers on how Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev authorized the transfer of a valuable Russian-owned property in Palestine to Israel in exchange for shipments of Israeli citrus fruit, a deal that symbolized the strange intersection of ideology, trade, and geopolitics during a divided era. The land in question was part of the Russian Orthodox Church mission compound in Jerusalem, known as the Russian Compound. Built in the 19th century by Tsar Alexander II, it covered nearly 68,000 square meters of prime land in central Jerusalem. This compound was one of Imperial Russia's most significant religious and cultural footprints in the Holy Land. But after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, ownership of these Russian church lands became a diplomatic puzzle. The newly atheist Soviet regime inherited the titles, but had little practical use for church property in what was then British-ruled Palestine. After the establishment of Israel in 1948, the status of these Russian properties became an even more complex issue. Israel recognized the Soviet Union as one of the first countries to acknowledge its independence, and the Kremlin saw Israel as a potential socialist ally in the Middle East, at least initially. In this context, the question of ownership over Russian church lands resurfaced. By 1964, under Khrushchev's leadership, the Soviet Union and Israel concluded a pragmatic arrangement. The USSR agreed to transfer ownership of the so-called Russian compound in West Jerusalem to the Israeli government. In return, Israel compensated Moscow not with hard currency, which would have been diplomatically and financially complicated, but with agricultural exports, primarily Jaffa oranges, Israel's most famous export at the time. The deal became colloquially known as the Orange Deal. The trade was not symbolic alone. For Israel, securing legal ownership of a central part of Jerusalem was a major political and administrative achievement, strengthening its control over the city's western sector at a time when Jerusalem remained divided, with Jordan controlling the eastern half. For the Soviet Union, which was struggling with a shortage of hard currency and wanted to avoid a politically awkward direct sale of church land, the barter arrangement made economic sense. The USSR gained valuable agricultural imports while maintaining the appearance of a transaction rooted in diplomacy rather than profit. The deal also reflected Khrushchev's pragmatic approach to foreign policy. Unlike Stalin's more ideological hostility toward Israel, Khrushchev's early years in power were marked by cautious flexibility. During the late 1950s and early 1960s, Moscow was still testing its relationships across the Middle East, oscillating between support for Arab nationalist regimes like Egypt under Gamal Abdel Nasser and occasional economic cooperation with Israel. The Jerusalem land transaction was a rare moment of quiet cooperation before Soviet-Israeli relations deteriorated in the following decade. The Orange Deal also carried deeper symbolic weight. It represented the transformation of Russia's centuries-old religious presence in the Holy Land into a Cold War economic exchange. The transaction effectively ended the Russian Orthodox Church's historical ownership of the compound, turning what had once been a symbol of Tsarist devotion into a token of Soviet pragmatism. But the geopolitical winds soon shifted. By 1967, after the Six-Day War, the Soviet Union severed diplomatic relations with Israel and aligned firmly with the Arab bloc. The Land for Oranges Agreement stood as one of the last direct bilateral deals between the two nations before 2 decades of Cold War hostility. In retrospect, the transaction reveals how even seemingly minor economic exchanges can mirror the broader strategic tensions of their time. What looked like a barter of land for fruit was in truth a reflection of how states balance ideology, economics, and influence. Khrushchev's decision to trade Russian land in Jerusalem for Israeli oranges was not merely a curiosity of diplomacy, it was a microcosm of the pragmatic, transactional nature of Soviet foreign policy during the Cold War. It demonstrated that even amid ideological divides, nations could find common ground in trade, even if it meant exchanging history itself for a shipment of oranges.